involve new economic forums launched in October, led by the U.S. Treasury and China's Finance Ministry and Central Bank.
Yellen is expected to urge Beijing against flooding markets. Such practices include using massive industrial subsidies and shutting U.S. companies out of domestic markets. The meeting comes just days before the U.S.-hosted APEC summit in San Francisco next week.
By the government agency Iowa Division of Banking. Here is NTD Business host Don Ma to discuss the details. Don, tell us more about the situation here.
So Citizens Bank is the fifth bank to fail in the U.S. this year, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, was put in charge to protect the money of the bank's customers. The full balance of all deposit accounts from Citizens Bank in Sac City, Iowa, it has been transferred to another bank, and this bank is called Iowa Trust and Savings Bank. So this bank will now take care of all the money that was in Citizens Bank to ensure it's safe. So basically, depositors of Citizens Bank will now become depositors of Iowa Trust and Savings. And in addition to that, taking over all the deposits from Citizens Bank, Iowa Trust and Savings Bank also agreed to buy nearly all of its assets as well. So what this means is that they're acquiring things like loans, investments, other holdings as well. And the two branches of Citizens Bank will actually reopen as branches of Iowa Trust and Savings Bank today during normal business hours.
Does this bank's failure pose any systemic threat?
Well, I don't think so, because this bank doesn't have enough assets to pose any threat to the overall U.S. banking system. Citizens Bank had approximately $66 million in total assets and $59 million in total deposits as of September 30th. The FDIC estimates that the cost to the deposit insurance fund will be $14.8 million. Now, this would be a different story if Citizens Bank had somewhere around $1 billion, but it does not have that. And at the same time, I think the Federal Reserve would not let a bank fail that had any systemic risk. So, we would probably see the central bank bailing them out if that were the case.
Don, what was the cause that led to the failure?
So what we know right now for sure is that the bank incurred significant loan losses. But, as for what those loans are exactly, it's hard to know for sure. But I think a number of different things could have been. But one that seems to be getting some attention is that the bank could have had too much exposure to bad trucking loans. It's possible that the bank was making loans on very expensive trucks, which would have been highly speculative. But, regardless, the last 2 years have been very difficult for the trucking industry. Trucking companies, large and small, have been going out of business. Too much supply, not enough demand, too many trucks chasing too little freight. And I'll just say one more thing. Even though it seems like bank failures are a big deal, they actually happen pretty often.
NTD Business's Don Ma, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Clocked a deficit in the measure for the first time since records began. Citizens Bank closes its doors, the fifth bank to fail in the U.S. this year. What's happening?
Act has received bipartisan support since the beginning. Lawmakers say it's critical to countering China's influence in Africa. Indo-Pacific countries are finding themselves stuck between China and the United States. But U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says they shouldn't have to choose sides. In a speech ahead of this month's APEC summit, Yellen sought to reassure Asian countries that Washington is trying to avoid dividing the global economy. Here's what she said.
The United States does not seek to decouple from China. A full separation of our economies, or an approach in which countries, including those in the Indo-Pacific, are forced to take sides, would have significant negative global repercussions. We have no interest in such a divided world and its disastrous effects.
Yellen said that fully decoupling from China's economy isn't practical. She talked about the complexity of Asian supply chains and the region's deep economic ties to China. Yellen said the U.S. is instead seeking to diversify from China by investing in manufacturing at home and by boosting ties with allies around the world, including others in the Indo-Pacific. Her comments came amid concerns over geopolitical tensions between the world's two largest economies. Those disagreements have led to growing controls on export and national security technologies.
More aggressive moves from Beijing in international airspace. Canada's defense minister says a Chinese military airplane fired flares at Canadian pilots last Sunday. That's while they were flying over international waters in the South China Sea. He called Beijing's move reckless and said it risked downing the aircraft. The incident marks the second of its kind in just 2 weeks. Take a look at this clip showing Chinese fighter jet getting less than 10 feet from a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber last Tuesday. The U.S. military warned the plane used uncontrolled excessive speed flying below and in front of the B-52 and nearly caused a collision. 4 weeks on trial, naming Sam Bankman-Fried guilty of stealing billions of dollars Thursday. But reports say there's more to the case than fraud and money laundering, and it's tied to China. Bankman-Fried is the founder and CEO of cryptocurrency exchange FTX and linked crypto trading company Alameda Research. According to testimony from ex-Alameda CEO Caroline Ellison, Bankman-Fried allegedly directed staff to deliver a bribe, quote, in the ballpark of $100 million to Chinese state officials. It happened in 2021. To grease the wheels for the return of $1 billion in Alameda trading funds. Beijing had frozen the cash months prior as part of a money laundering investigation. Ellison said the funds made up a substantial amount of the company's trading capital at the time. After the freeze, a team was put together to recover it, including Ellison and 2 staff members with, quote, connections to China. The bribe came after several failed attempts to get the money back. Some staff members reportedly objected to the idea, but were told to stay quiet. Ellison testified that the company did quietly recover the funds after nearly a year. Bankman-Fried did not face bribery charges during the trial. He now faces up to 110 years in prison for stealing.
Increased prices. However, a Goldman Sachs study showed that they only increased prices a quarter of a percent, which is 25 cents on a $100 toaster, for example.
So then it sounds like Americans would be paying even more. Given all that's at stake here, especially with the tensions we're seeing globally and especially between the U.S. and China, how should the U.S. be approaching this meeting? Just not have the meeting? What is the message we should be sending?
I don't think we should have scheduled the meeting or pushed for the meeting to begin with. I think we should show a very tough stand against China and say that we're never going to meet with a genocidal dictator that is not taking strong action on, for example, fentanyl that kills 70,000 Americans every year. It's atrocious to meet with someone who's refused to cooperate on fentanyl. Just that issue alone should make a meeting between our president and Xi Jinping a non-starter.
And in your piece, you mentioned that the CCP should be considered a criminal entity and an adversary of the U.S., not a competitor. How would that distinction change the way the U.S. does policy when it comes to the Chinese regime?
I think we should gradually, essentially, criminalize the activity of what they're doing. Arguably, they're already something like a terrorist organization or a mafia-like organization in terms of the Chinese Communist Party. I think we need to start dealing more directly with the Chinese people who are good and who, need our support. Taiwan needs our support. Hong Kong needs our support. But our focus on negotiating with the CCP, I think, is like negotiating with the mafia when it's the neighborhood that the mafia rules over that needs our help.